We come to the 8th presentation in this year-long excursion into what I have called the Parayana, and its subtitle is the Refreshing the Way into the High Dharma. And this photograph of the Earth as the moon, from the moon, of Terra from Luna. And one of the most interesting documents is the concluding volume 2 of the Apollo 17 expedition to Luna. Interestingly enough, this whole series, published by Apogee Books, and Apogee, of course, in celestial mechanics, is that of the closest approach of coming in, is a Canadian publisher. So that all of the beautiful flights leading up to the Apollo moon mission are not published by NASA. They're not published in the United States, they're published in Canada. And this particular cover features the lunar rover, which is extremely interesting. It was first used in the later Apollo missions, Apollo 15, 16, 17 especially, and Apollo 17 is quite interesting because the lunar rover and the whole idea of a transformative vehicle that has brought humankind, men, from their world, the old Earth, into a new world where the old Earth now looks like a satellite. It looks like the moon. And Apollo 17 is of great hermetic interest to those few who are following the large-scale structure of civilization on this particular planet in this particular star system, that Apollo 17 is curiously close to plate 17 in a classic hermetic treatise called Splendor Solis, the splendor of the sun. And it is about alchemy, and Splendor Solis is reprinted here some decades ago now, and is very difficult to find in London. And the original was published, its author is Solomon Trismussen, and Solomon Trismussen is famous for all time as being one of the two teachers, one of the two hermetic guides for Paracelsus. Paracelsus, whose name Theophrastus, Bombastus, Paracelsus, von Hohenheim, was a very difficult character, hard to get along with, because he was torrential and impatient with the old, which he knew to be quite false, in fact, riddled with a corruption that hermetically was a signal that a transformational process was in play. The first stage in an alchemy is the corruption of the old falsity. It begins to go through a process of not just dismemberment, but of dissolve, of coming back to that kind of a universal liquidity, which allows then for a reconstellation of what is new to emerge, much like a caterpillar will go into its cocoon and will liquefy and then will re-emerge as the beginnings of a butterfly, and the cocoon, when it opens, the butterfly will come out drying its wings, and when they are dry, we'll be able to beautifully fly into the flowery fields away and beyond. So too, the development of the exploration of space is that kind of a hermetic process, which includes not only the alchemy, but also the astronomy of symbols. It used to be called in shorthand astrology, but astrology was a limited co-opting of the facility of prediction, and not at all interested except for those who wanted to find out what the meaning of a horoscope really is, and why there are interesting developments that constantly go on and that lead to astronomy in the sense of an astrophysics as we've had since the 1890s beginning. And so astrophysics and alchemy together were the two hands of the Hermetic tradition that in the first century of our common era, the first century AD, Anno Domini, was a transform that brought in a new time form in the sense that it confirmed that there has been a serious, major transformation where the old has liquefied progressively and something new then has reconstellated itself and is now emerging and has emerged and now has dried its wings. And remember that the Greek word for butterfly is psyche, suke. It means butterfly. That the psyche is capable of a major transformation, not just little corrections, but a major transformation. And that transformation is so epochal that it's called the beginnings of a new epoch, or the chosen word in Greek from the ancient language origins was a new aeon. A new eon, a new epoch, a new aeon, which really means a new time form. Now, in our time, in the late 20th century, one of the most powerful of all of the teachings spread around the world is the Kala Chakra Tantra. And the major giver of the Kala Chakra Tantra is the Dalai Lama. This is the Wisdom Books publication from London and Boston of the whole, not just the ceremony, the ritual, the initiation, but Kala Chakra. Chakra means wheel in Sanskrit, the chakras. And Kala is like the root of kalpa. It means time. So that the Kala Chakra is the wheel of time, and the Tantra is that it is a advanced, expanded teaching from what was there before as a thread, as a sutra, that the sutras have blossomed into the tantras, and that the sutras were able to show a path. In Sanskrit, path in a formal way is a vada. It's a way. The way of the thread, the way of the sutra, and those who have taken it, become then elders, and the Sanskrit, especially in the Buddha's Magadhi dialect of Sanskrit, is a thera, the thera, so that the way of the elders was the Theravada, and the Theravada was the original way in which the path-oriented Buddha's path was delivered and kept for about 500 years. The Buddha himself, in many of his, as Bertrand Russell would call them, disquisitions, in Latin sermones, sermons, remembered and then written down, and the written down remembrance was the sutra, and those who observed the sutra, the sangha, the community, used the dharma, the truth of the Buddha's path, the sutra, to keep the sangha alive and coherent throughout an entire time form. But the historical Buddha himself pointed out several times, poignantly, that time cycles come into decay, that there will come a time where after a period of some 500 years there will be a lessening, and after another time period, such time period, there will be more of a lessening, and after a long time period there will be a lessening to such an extent that it will not be distinguishable any longer as something not just special, but of poignantly, uniquely real. And at that point, a new Buddha will need to come into play. The Hermetic coming together was brought in the 90s AD, from 90 to about 100, a little bit more than 100 AD. Actually, one could say it's 90 AD to 101 AD. In that decade plus is the last decade of the life of St. John. St. John went to sleep, is the polite way to really say it. He didn't die or just die. When he was 77 years old in 101 AD by normal computation, but the fact is Jesus was born in what ostensibly is 9 BC, and so St. John went to sleep 110 years after the birth of Jesus. In that time period, that last decade or so, an entire time form transformed in such a way that it had a 1-2 punch. The first is the leading of the left hook, which gives the beginnings of how this is going to play out, and then the real knockout punch is the pulling of the trigger, the releasing of the dried winged butterfly of the psyche to make its way into a new scalar of freedom and a new depth of life, a new height of meaning, a new penetration of yet again what in normal worldly outlooks is called a cycle. The cycle renews, not just to be a cycle, but comes as a ratcheting up because it's really a spiral. If you circumscribe a circle and then you put it into movement, which means that you put it into the dimension of time, that circle will spiral. And as it spirals, it makes a cone of a dynamic, and that cone of that dynamic is familiar to anyone who understands that light actually isn't just a light source that keeps on going, but that there's a cone of light that comes through. So that the development then of advanced geometry involves being able not only to have circles and squares and triangles, lines, points, and so angles and so forth, but one must master what are called conic sections. That cones will have a straight cut, which will be a larger or smaller circle, or an oblique cut, in which case one has an ellipse or an oval of varying size, and also there is such a thing as the cone continues to open so that one can understand, because conic sections at this kind of level of penetration, mathematically, hermetically, one understands that it isn't just a cone, but every single source of light is an overlaying of cones, and that one has an incredible complexity, actually, and that reality is more than one could believe. You do not have brain enough to grind upon the poignant reality of actuality. That was a paraphrase of Ben Jonson's description of those who would read the plays of Shakespeare. In the opening of the first folio, 1623, he said, "Dear reader, you are being presented with the greatest literature that we have had since the beginning of written literature. It stands alongside the classics of Greek tragedy, of what has just recently been published as the translation of the King James Version of the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament. This is a language which came into its maturation at the same time that the Bible into English came into its gestation. The original sally forth into making what became the King James Bible in 1611 was done in the early 1580s by a group of pals, and they were more than just friends, they were pals. And one of them was Sir Philip Sidney, another was Edmund Spencer, and their continental friend Giordano Bruno, and a number of other geniuses. And it was Sir Philip Sidney who began seeing that it took a new poetic in English to be able to translate the poetic core of the Old Testament, which had been for 1,600 years, for 1,600 years, the poetic that was the metronome of the genius of the Old Testament were the Psalms of David, of King David. Because those psalms, the royal psalms, they're called in criticality scholarship in the 19th century and into the 20th century, but David did not just write songs, he wrote psalms, which were like holy prayer songs to his lute, to his ability to sing his poetic, and some of the deep Hermetic understanding of that is that that lyre that King David used was not an instrument that was available previously to the scalar that it was in King David's maturity, and because that lute was an instrument that had come into play just about 500 years before King David was born. And that lute was in Greek called a lyre. And the lyre to a holy poetic was the development of what since then has been considered just a mythic figure, the figure of Orpheus. It is Orpheus who first brings the lyre into play with a poetic language which is able then, the reduced saying is that Orpheus sang so sweetly, very polite, that he charmed wild animals to be tamed. Now, in a wisdom hermetic way, this is understanding that this is a transformative language, that one does not just speak it. It's not about business. It's not about ruling. It's not about laws. It's not about transactional gains. It's not about arguments. It's not about this and that or the other, or as they used to say in Tennessee, t'other. It's singing in such a way that the nature that is beyond understanding that it's within an order becomes ordered. Music soothes the savage beast, but there is also an aspect to music where it is completely upsetting, where the lute of Orpheus was the way in which someone like a King David was able to soothe, because he was one of the original toughies. He was one of the greatest warriors of his day. The fact that everyone remembers that even as a young adolescent, he slew Goliath. Can you imagine what it takes for a teenager with a slingshot and a stone to throw it with such effort and penetration and accuracy that it literally killed Goliath in one blow? A man larger than 7 feet. David was, he looked like the classic Popeye. King David was about 5'8", very stocky and tremendously muscled and disciplined, even as an adolescent coming in. And the old David was one of the great warriors. So David's psalms were psalms from someone who had been the heavyweight champion among tough guys, who had come to understand from a relationship that was special with a woman who was extraordinarily special. And King David, like a movie star or rock star in his time, had a passel but it was Bathsheba who awakened in him the quality of understanding that there is a love which absorbs desire, which transforms lust, which makes possible a refinement. And out of this comes a new quality of mankind, a new birth. And when Bathsheba became pregnant and gave birth to a son, King David vowed that this son of ours will inherit my kingdom. He will be my son, the son, who will not only take over the kingdom, he will be the beacon, excellence of the beauty of love, the truthfulness of our coming together, and the Psalms of David, the later royal Psalms of King David, are extraordinary visions. So that the translating, David lived about 1000 BC. Sir Philip Sidney died young. He was just in his 30s in the Netherlands in one of the wars in the 1580s. And so almost 1600 years. And Sir Philip's translation of the Psalms of David had only gotten so far. And no one who was around him, even geniuses like Sir Edmund Spenser, who wrote the Fairy Queen, were unable to continue the Psalms of David translated as Sir Philip Sidney had done so, because Sir Philip himself had fallen in love and had married and had come to understand King David's psalm making to a T. In fact, the wife of Sir Philip Sidney was the daughter of Sir Francis Walsingham. And for those who do not know, there was a CIA working for Queen Elizabeth, and Sir Francis Walsingham was the head of that CIA. He was the head of Elizabethan intelligence, and he was an assassin par excellence, so that you never even knew that so-and-so was marked, gone, over incredible time. And Sir Philip Sidney was his son-in-law, and highly held, but the only person who could continue Sir Philip's language, his poetic, was his sister Mary. And Mary Sidney married the Earl of Pembroke, and when he asked Lady Pembroke, Mary Sidney, where she would like to live, she said, I really don't want to live this far out in Wales, or I don't want to live in London. Well, where would you like to live? She said, I would like to live within visual sight of Stonehenge. And in those days, men heeded through real love the real women that they were really married to. And so they lived within sight across the Wiltshire plain of Stonehenge. And it's there that she finished the last 2/3 of the Psalms of David. And when you look at Mary Sidney's Psalms of David, you get a feminine genius coming into play that, great as Sir Philip Sidney's poetry, and he was really magnificent. His great, huge, epic poem was called Arcadia, which he did and then redid as a new Arcadia. And he was just getting started, being perhaps on the level that Shakespeare in poetry would have become. But Mary Sidney's English, and she, like all of the really educated British upper class royalty of the time, were able to read Hebrew. They were able to read Greek, Latin, English, French, Spanish, etc., etc. In other words, for them, language was an open book. And her reading of King David's Hebrew Psalms, and one has to understand that Hebrew by 1000 BC was the first time that the language, that Hebrew as a language, was able to be written. and written on a level of King David's Psalms. A twin of King David is Homer. Homer is the first time that Greek can be written so that it can be read by those who knew classical Greek, like David's Psalms could be read by those who knew classical Hebrew. There they are. One can read. It is the written language that is the fermentation of vision. It is the written language raised to a poetic that is the distillation of history. And from the fermentation of vision, one gets art, and from the distillation of history, one gets science. So that in the Hermetic tradition, the arts and sciences go together like the two wings of a butterfly. And this wing flies in visionary, infinite, differential conscious space. This one flies in kaleidoscopic, new civilization space. And in this way, it really occurs. Something new can fly and fly farther than belief could have even imagined before by those who stay where they were, or regress back to where they need to be, or want to be, or insist upon being, like this generation in the United States is back in the early 1950s. And for those of us who lived through the haunted 50s, as I.F. Stone called them, in all of his collected writings at the time, they were haunted. They were haunted deeper than any of us at the time knew, except for those who had the science fiction vision. They understood that the American 1950s came in with an incredible tragic wound. A tragic wound that was highlighted by a suicide. A suicide of one of the toughest men in the Truman administration. He was the Secretary of War, the Secretary of Defense, as they politely tried to skew it. His name was James Forrestal. And in 1949, he leapt from the 16th floor of the hospital in Washington, D.C. to smash himself on the pavement because he said, I can't get them out of my mind. I can't get them out of my mind. Because he was the first on that level to personally see and be contacted by an alien life form who telepathically projected a complexity that not just dwarfed the world that James Forrestal was important in, but it evaporated completely any kind of tethers of confidence and certainty that he could have faked or mustered. And his last action was to cancel, before he went to the hospital as a breakdown, his last professional action as Secretary of War was to cancel the MX 775 project. In that project, in New Mexico, in White Sands, New Mexico, where the first atomic bomb had been set off in 1945, only 4 years later, almost within, I'm sure, telephoning distance, a two-stage rocket, a WAC-based with a corporal rocket. That WAC corporal two-stage rocket was sent up 250 miles into space. Farther into space than the International Space Station is, and that was in February, we're in February, of 1949. 51 plus 14 is 65 years ago. 2/3 of a century ago. He canceled it. Because there was no more sense in having a space program. Because they're here. They are so far beyond us that it's not even feasible, that all of this is a joke, all of this is a ridiculous charade. And Forrestal had no hermetic guidance whatsoever to understand that all of this, poor fellow, has been seen in spades before, long time before, have dealt with this incredibly before, thousands of years ago. And that's why we do what we do and are going where we're going, because we understand what it takes and how to teach it and how to bring it through, so that instead of committing suicide and canceling what is just now tremendously new, that you can have something like the 17th illustration to Splendor Solis, like Apollo 17, and it has a chariot just like the lunar rover, and it has the alchemical, hermetically sealed, it's called a cucurbers. That vessel contains a queen who is bare-breasted, who is surrounded by an oval rainbow, a halo of energy, and down below are men who are able to follow this in mission control. And here is a whole globe. They thought it was the Earth globe, but it can be also the new lunar globe, that one is understanding that we are now through the cocoon stage. We're drying our wings, and we're ready for the psyche, for the suke, for the butterfly to fly. Let's take a little break.